If you'd like, you can go ahead and open up your Bible to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. It is so good again to be here with you this morning. This is one of my favorite days of the week, and I hope that's true for you too. It just gives you a boost to go throughout the rest of the week when you're going into work on Mondays or dealing with people on Tuesday or whatever it is. Now, we'll be fair to my Golden Agers. My other favorite day of the week is Tuesday, because of Golden Agers class, and then my other favorite day of the week is Wednesday. So I've got 3 favorite days of the week. And if you come to church as much as I do, then you'd have 3 favorite days of the week as well. But we're just so grateful for you to be here. We know that you could have been anywhere that you'd like to have been, yet you chose to be with us here at North Broad. For those of you listening online, we're thankful that you're tuning in as well. And we know that you also have access to literally probably millions of live streams, and yet you decided to tune in to ours. And so we're just so grateful that you could be with us, and we hope one day in the future you can be with us in person. Did I tell you to turn to Matthew 1 or Matthew 2? That works. That'll do. I mean, when it's close to Christmas, you can just open up to Matthew 1 and start reading, and you're liable to get something right. So in Matthew chapter 1, we read about the record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The beautiful thing about the Incarnation, that is about God becoming man, is not just that Jesus is like God, but that God is like Jesus. Do you get that? When we see all the compassion that Jesus had for the sick, the love that he had for the poor, the patience that he had with the publicans and people like Zacchaeus, then we just shout out in joy, knowing that our God is just like that. The Incarnation, as the title slide says, transforms the way that we see everyone and everything. And I hope through just surveying the background of Jesus here in Matthew chapter 1, and then talking about a few stories from the Bible, that we just see how radical of a story the Incarnation is. As we go from Matthew 1 now to Matthew chapter 2, Jesus is now born in Bethlehem, not in Jerusalem with the palace and the temple and all the glory, born in Bethlehem, 5 miles south, a small village. Jesus is born and people come to visit him, but then Herod the king discovers that there's this child who's called the Messiah. It's going to be the son of David that would reign on the throne, and he feels threatened by this. One beautiful thing about the Christmas story, if you look at the book of Luke, is 2 pregnant women getting together and plotting the overthrow of the empire. They're sitting there talking about how, well, my son's going to go before yours and pave the way, and, well, my son's going to bring salvation to Jerusalem. And to them at that time, that meant some kind of physical salvation from the Roman Empire, because they're being greatly oppressed. One of the difficult things about reading the Bible is that we are all 21st century Americans who live in one of the most wealthy countries in the world. Think how these stories must mean, how they meant to the people to whom they were originally written. Peasants living under the Roman Empire, being taxed ridiculous amounts of money and being oppressed in every which way. Think how it meant to the conquered nations to whom Paul wrote. The people that Paul wrote to weren't just the Romans. Paul wrote to places like Thessalonica and Macedonia, people who were being oppressed by Roman rule and had their towns taken over by Roman occupation. Think how these stories must have meant to people like that, and think how difficult it might be for us to relate to some of these stories as we read them from our very sort of comfortable lives. And yet here's Jesus, born into a manger, born in Bethlehem, born of a young woman, Mary, and now Herod is after him. The text says here in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 7, Herod secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time that the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him." Here's one thing that we have to keep in mind. Whenever a political leader like Herod starts talking about wanting to go and worship the king or worship God, they're probably lying to get their way in some kind of way. People who don't really follow God like Herod, who are trying to go find Jesus or say that they're going to find Jesus, they're usually trying to pull a fast one on you. And that's what Herod's trying to do here. I think about how many times, sometimes we're told that so-and-so is going to uphold the Christian values or whatever, and then, they do the very opposite of what they say that they're going to do. How many times do we do that, though? Call ourselves Christians, but bear the name of God in vain by not acting like it every other day of the week besides Sunday. It's an important lesson to learn. So they go and they search for the child, and of course, they go the other way. They know what's up because they're wise men. Foolish men, they fall to tricks like Herod, but wise men, they know to read between the lines and to go the other way. So what happens then is they escape to Egypt in verses 13 through 15 because God comes to them through an angel and says, Herod's going to be after your son, and you have to get out. And so the very first thing that happens, the very first thing that happens to Jesus after he's born is he is a political refugee fleeing a king, a tyrant who's after his life. How many of us have been in that kind of situation? None of us. Our forefathers did, though, when they came to America, right? They were fleeing political and religious tyrants in a way. Maybe some of, depending on our ancestors. I know that one of my ancestors, it's an apocryphal story, but I'm still going to count it as real, baptized George Washington. So, we go back a long ways. But the tyrant King George and all this. But we can't really identify with Jesus going to Egypt and fleeing this political tyrant. But it had to be comforting to know what Mary was told back in Matthew chapter 1. That his name would be Emmanuel, which is God with us. While they were in the manger, the mystery of the Incarnation would teach them God is with us. While they were being visited by the Magi, while things were going pretty good, they're receiving gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They even knew in those good times that God is with us. And while they were political refugees fleeing Herod, they knew even then, Emmanuel, God is with us. One of the challenges I'm going to pose to you in the sermon this morning is we know that God is with us, but is God also with them? And so we're going to try to identify these terms, us and them, and try to realize that God is with the whole human family. People that are fleeing kings like Herod who are after their life and who are after their children. And also people like Rahab and people like the man in the ditch and the Samaritan who saved him. God is with us, but the mystery of the Incarnation teaches us that God is with all of us and that we should treat each other as if that is the truth. And to do this, I want to tell a few stories. They're Bible stories, but to make them more relatable to us, I've changed some of the scenarios and changed some of the events, but the core of the story is going to remain the same, and you'll probably be able to figure it out which story I'm talking about relatively quickly. I'm going to tell you about a buddy of mine whose name is Phil, who was traveling in Albuquerque on some business. And as he was out there, he wanted to go see some of the rock formations out in the desert. And so he drove his car out, and he was out looking. Very, very hot summer. And sure enough, he runs out of gas. In some of those places, if you've been on those long stretches of interstate, if you don't get gas when they tell you to, no gas station for 20 miles or whatever, you're in trouble. And he didn't, and so he ran out of gas. And as he's sitting there contemplating what he was going to do, because doing that where he was pretty much a death sentence without having the proper supplies, he sees a car coming his way. It looks like a rental car, he assumes. And so as it gets closer, he steps up to the side of the road to motion for help, and the man pulls over. It's an African man wearing some traditional African garments. He speaks with a thick accent, and he introduces himself as Ethan. Phil and Ethan, Phil Ethiopian, I don't know, it kind of worked to me. But anyways, he talks to the man, and the man invites him into the car. He says, come in with me, I'll go take you, we'll go to the gas station. There's one, 80 miles down there or whatever, and we're going to go get you some gas and get you fixed up. So Phil gets into the car, and as they're driving and they're talking, and Ethan begins to tell him about some of his background, about how he comes from a predominantly Muslim country, but he considers himself sort of non-religious. He has his suspicions, but he's just not quite sure. And as they're driving, Ethan asks if it's okay if he can turn back up the radio a little bit. And Phil says, yeah, sure, go ahead, whatever you need to do. And Phil recognizes that he's listening to a Christian radio station. He's going, Ethan, I thought you were religious. Why are you listening to a Christian radio station? He said, I don't know. It was the only thing I could pick up, and it didn't sound too bad, so I thought I'd listen to it. He said, can you tell me what these lyrics mean since you're a Christian? And he began at that verse, and he preached unto him Jesus. And as they're going along the way, they came across this farmhouse with a swimming pool out front. And Ethan said, see, water. What hinders me from being baptized? Now, how many of us would take that chance? Here's somebody, we don't know where they're from, we don't really know much about them. They talk kind of strange. They might not have the best English. They might dress a little funny. But how many of us would take that chance to teach to them the gospel, to take the opportunity that God has given us to share with him the good news? Because if God is with us, Emmanuel, God with us, then we have to believe that God is with him as well. And we have to believe that maybe in some way the Spirit has brought us to that place for such a time as this, to where we might be able to teach to him the good news. See, whenever Philip approached the chariot there in Acts chapter 8, the man in that chariot was a eunuch. We know that in the beginning God made them male and female. But in Matthew chapter 19, when Jesus is talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, he has a little line in there about eunuchs, and he says some were born natural, some were made eunuchs, and some were eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Someone who, due to the actions of someone else or maybe their own, doesn't neatly fit into those kind of categories. Someone who wouldn't have been allowed into the temple like everybody else was. Someone who wouldn't have been able to and go through the ceremonial washings like everyone else was. Someone who was called a dry tree because they couldn't have children. And under the old covenant, in order to produce children of God, what did you have to have? You had to have a man and a woman. And this is a man who couldn't do that. And yet, he faithfully went to that temple year by year on pilgrimages because of his love for God. Now, Philip could treat him like everyone else did. And he's not a full part of the covenant community like me. He's not a real Jew like I am. He's an Ethiopian eunuch. Or he could have followed the way of Emmanuel, God with us, and climbed up into the chariot and preached unto him Jesus and took a chance. If God is with us, is God with them? Is God with people who don't look like us, don't talk like us, have different backgrounds than us? I'm going to tell you another little story here. The picture is a coffee shop. There's a woman sitting in the corner, black hair, piercings, tattoos. She's wearing a service uniform of some kind. You might think it's maybe she washes dishes or works at a fast food restaurant or something like that. And she's crying. And she has a newspaper in front of her, and she's circling classified help wanted ads, trying to figure out what she's going to do. But the most noticeable thing about her is that she's not sitting as close to the table as another woman might because she is very pregnant, very pregnant. And she's just distraught. And you sit there and you notice her for a bit, and then all of a sudden a man comes in, an older man, very gentle, very kind, and he surveys the coffee shop. And it was almost as if he was looking for her. He makes a beeline straight towards her, and he sits across from her at the table, and they start talking and laughing and crying together, and he holds her hands, and he tells her everything's going to be okay. And then you kind of listen in, and you hear him say, and your son's going to do great. He's going to be just a wild donkey of a man. And she starts laughing, and she grabs her belly because she knows that Ishmael, who is there in her tummy, what exactly that meant, because he has kicked her and kicked her all night long. And so she knows what it means for him to be a wild donkey of a man. And she looks at that man in the face, and she says, thank you so much for seeing me. You see, in the Bible, people named all kinds of things after God. Rocks, and piles of rocks and wells and all donkey jawbones, But there was only one person in the entire Bible who gave God a name, and that was Hagar, the slave woman from Egypt who was kicked out of her own house by her master's wife. The master who just stood aside and let Sarah do whatever she wanted to her. And she ran her out of the house. She's in the wilderness alone and pregnant and didn't know what to do. She doesn't have any money or wealth herself. She has no way of living. She thinks she might just die. And yet God comes to her. And he sees her. and Hagar was the only person in the entire Bible to give God a name, and she called him the one who sees. What about us? Do we have the ability to see people like that? Or do our prejudices and presuppositions and the stories that we come up with about these kinds of people, do they override our need to go and talk to them about God, to share with them the good news, to be there for them, to see them like that? Philip took a chance getting into that chariot with the eunuch. But God cares so much that he didn't send Philip to another city of the Samaritans or to a big metropolitan area where he can maybe convert thousands of people. He sent him down a desert pathway just to save one soul. Is one soul worth it to us? The slave woman Hagar, who's stranded out in the wilderness, being kicked out of the house by her master Sarah. Do we care enough about those kind of people to see them and go to them? They might give us a lot of trouble. They might cost us some money. But isn't their soul worth it? If God is with us, isn't it also true that God is with them? Haven't we so blessed to be in the presence of God day in and day out, to love him and to serve him? Shouldn't we offer that opportunity to every single person around us? And I know this church has, from some of the stories that I've heard. But what do these stories about Hagar and the Ethiopian eunuch teach us about and give comfort to single mothers and single fathers, divorcees and people who've been victims of domestic violence, people who are maybe in a lower social class or who are a foreigner in a new land? These stories should give comfort to those kinds of people, but they should also give us encouragement to go to those kinds of people and to share with them this good news of Christ in us. Let's go to Matthew chapter 25 and look at verses 31 and following. A passage I know that we're all familiar with, and when we were little, we probably sang that song, I don't want to be a goat, nope, I just want to be a sheep, bye, Matthew 25:31. We're going to skip down a little bit, though, to verse 34. The king says to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared before you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Now, we know what the righteous say back, but we do know that Jesus was in all of those situations, wasn't he? The Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He was having to flee from Herod when he was just a baby. They would have to depend upon the hospitality of whatever village they came to. Jesus experienced all those types of situations. And here's what the righteous say in verse 37. "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" When he uses that expression, "see you," that should remind you of Hagar. Because God is a God who sees. God is a God who sees the people who are on the lowest of on the totem pole as well as the highest. He sees everyone, and he's there for everyone. God is with us, not with us, the Americans, not even with us, the Christians. There were no Christians when Emmanuel was named. But God is with us. God is for everyone. God desires all to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. Paul wrote to Timothy. Paul wrote to Peter wrote to his people, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. God sees all of us. He wants the best for all of us. We have to ask if our desires line up with his. So in Matthew 25, the king answers and he says in verse 40, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it for one of the least of these my brothers or sisters of mine, you did it for me." God with us, Emmanuel. See, that's the message, that's the challenge of what people call the Christmas story from Matthew and from Luke. That God is with all of us. He's come to save all of us. And it's our job to take that message, that good news, to everyone that we can. The Hagars of the world, the eunuchs of the world, and even the Herods of the world. Now, John the Baptist tried to do that, and we know what happened to him. But isn't one soul worth it when we know where our inheritance lies? You see? Are we willing to take that chance like God was willing to take that chance on us? We have to learn to see Christ in everyone. But we also have here another passage in Matthew chapter 25, a less happy one. The king says in verse 41, he will also say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you accursed people, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they themselves will also answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or as a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" And Jesus' answer is, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me either." See, we're so quick to help our friends, to help our family, but we also need to help those for whom Christ died. And who is that? Everybody. He thought that the eunuch was worth it. He went out of his way to get Philip there to teach him the good news. He thought Hagar was worth it. He met her at the well. I've heard of some churches who won't throw a bridal shower for unwed mothers. And yet God apparently didn't have a problem throwing a bridal shower for Hagar there at the well. But how many people do we see where we think, somebody else will take care of that? And like the Levite and the priest we passed by on the other side. We believe that God is with us, but in those situations, do we really believe that God is with them? Are we showing that by our actions? By being there for those who no one else is willing to be? That's the challenge of the birth of Jesus. I don't know if any of us, well, I'm sure there's people, I think everybody here would help out baby Jesus, no doubt about that. But had you known it was him, how many of us would have taken that family if we were Egyptians and this family came knocking on our door at night and saying, we're fleeing from Herod. Herod's out to kill our son. We've come all the way from Judah. We need help. We need shelter. How many of us would open up our door to Joseph and Mary and little 2-year-old Jesus? How many of us would have opened up our door to Hagar or to the eunuch? See, this is the challenge that the Bible gives us, because if we believe that Christ is with us, that God is with us, then we should learn to see Christ in everyone around us. The Christmas story challenges us to see God in the most unlikely people and places. Like Jesus, we need to learn to touch the untouchables, like he went to the lepers. We need to learn to remember the forgotten, like Jesus did with Zacchaeus hanging out in a tree, or like he did with Hagar at the well. Or maybe like Jonah in the belly of the fish. The people on the boat weren't too concerned about Jonah's safety, were they, when they chunked him overboard? God is a God who sees. And if we are to be his people, then we need to be a people who sees, as individuals and as the body of Christ. If we believe that God is with us, do we really believe that God is also with them? Studying for this message and reading some of these Bible stories and meditating on some of these things, it's really been hard for me, because you see so much pain and suffering in the world, and sometimes we feel guilty that we can't conquer all of it, save everybody. But I think that's not the point. I don't think when he talked about in Matthew 28, he didn't say go and convert everyone, go and save everyone. He said go preach to everyone, take a chance. And so I think what little bit that we all can do as individuals will help out in the long run. It takes all of us working together. But I don't think that we should use the excuse, we can't help everyone, as an excuse to not help some. You see, I think I've done that sometimes before. Or that excuse, well, somebody else will come along. What if Philip would have said that? Somebody else will be along to teach the eunuch the gospel. No, God put him in that particular place to serve that purpose. And so whenever someone comes into our life that needs to be seen, maybe it's not up to somebody else. Maybe that's God challenging us to do that in that moment. And we have to learn to accept the challenge if we're to be the people of God. This Christmas story is a wonderful story where we talk about the donkeys and the Christmas lights and everything like that, all the gifts that Jesus got. But it was also one of terror. Think of how scared they must have been fleeing to Egypt. We've got to learn to see that God is with us, not only in those good situations, but also in the bad. This morning, I would like to challenge you throughout this next week to be a person who sees. Find those people who've lost loved ones this year and who are going to have a tough Christmas, and be there for them. Look for those people who maybe never had a home, never had a family to celebrate with, and invite them to your gathering with your family. Be there for them. Be like God at the well, or like Philip in the chariot, or like the Samaritan in the ditch. Be there and help those kinds of people so that we can show God that we really believe that he is among us. As we stand and sing this next song, let's think about how he really is here and how we would act if we could see him physically right beside us. Because that's how it really is. He really is among us. Let's stand and sing.